While America fought a war overseas, a quiet air war was happening at home, where women flew military aircraft without being allowed to be called soldiers. Between 1942 and 1944, more than 1,000 women piloted every type of plane in the Army Air Force's arsenal. They ferried fighters and bombers across the country. They towed targets while men fired live ammunition. They tested aircraft fresh from the factory, and they trained the next generation of combat pilots. 38 of them died in service. Yet for more than 3 decades, their story was classified, forgotten, erased from the official record of World War II. This is the story of the Women Airforce Service Pilots, the WASPs, and how they fought to be remembered. December 1941. The United States entered World War II facing a massive logistical problem. American factories were building aircraft at an unprecedented rate. Thousands of fighters, bombers, and trainers rolling off assembly lines from coast to coast. But someone had to fly those planes from the factories to military bases, training fields, and embarkation points. That job was called ferrying, and it was essential to the war effort. Ferrying wasn't glamorous. It meant long, solo flights across the country, often in unfamiliar aircraft. Pilots navigated by maps and landmarks, no radar, no fighter escort. Weather could turn deadly in minutes. Mechanical failures were common, especially in newly built planes that hadn't been fully tested.
The Army Air Forces needed every experienced pilot it could find. But by 1942, the demand for combat pilots overseas had created a critical shortage at home. Experienced male pilots were desperately needed in Europe and the Pacific. The ferrying squadrons couldn't keep up. That's when 2 remarkable women, separately, proposed the same solution: let women fly. It wasn't a new idea. Women had been flying since the early days of aviation. By the 1940s, hundreds of American women held pilot licenses. Some were crop dusters, flight instructors, or air racers. A few had logged more flying hours than many military pilots. But the idea of women flying military aircraft was radical. The military had never done it, and in 1942, most Americans couldn't imagine it.
Yet the situation was desperate enough to try. Nancy Harkness Love was one of the most accomplished pilots of her generation. She earned her private pilot's license in high school. By 1940, she was ferrying military planes to the Canadian border, bound for Britain under the Lend-Lease program. In May 1940, Love wrote to military officials with a proposal: create a squadron of experienced women pilots to ferry aircraft. She even provided a list of 49 qualified women. The Army ignored it. Meanwhile, Jacqueline Cochran, a record-setting aviator and one of the most famous pilots in America, had the same idea, but with a different approach. Cochran envisioned a large-scale training program to create hundreds of new women pilots. In 1939, she wrote to First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, suggesting women pilots be used for non-combat missions. General Henry Hap Arnold, chief of the Army Air Forces, met with her but wasn't ready to commit. So Cochran went to England, where she volunteered with the British Air Transport Auxiliary, ferrying aircraft for the Royal Air Force. She wanted to prove that women could do the work. Then came Pearl Harbor. Everything changed.
By September 1942, the pilot shortage was undeniable. Nancy Love's proposal was finally approved. She was tasked with organizing the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, the WAFs. The requirements were strict: at least 500 hours of flying time, a commercial license, and age 21 to 35. 28 women made the cut. They were called the Originals. They began training at Newcastle Army Air Base in Delaware in September 1942. But here's the problem. Jacqueline Cochran returned from England the day before the WAF's announcement, and she was furious. She'd been promised leadership of any women's program. General Arnold, who'd been on medical leave, scrambled to fix the situation. His solution? 2 programs. Love would run the WAFs, a small group of experienced pilots who could start immediately.
Cochrane would create the Women's Flying Training Detachment, the WFTD, to train new pilots. Cochrane's first class of trainees began in November 1942 in Houston, then moved to a remote airfield in West Texas, Avenger Field, near the town of Sweetwater. On August 5, 1943, the 2 programs merged. The combined organization was called the Women Airforce Service Pilots, WASP. Cochrane became director. Love led the ferrying division. It was official. Women were flying for the U.S. military. Avenger Field became the only all-female airbase in American history. Except for male instructors and support staff, the base was run by and for women pilots. The training was intense. It mirrored the program for male cadets, but the women had to prove themselves twice over. Half the day was spent in ground school, meteorology, navigation, Morse code, military law, mechanics, parachute packing. The other half was flight training. They woke before dawn, they marched, they did calisthenics, they lived 6 to a room in barracks. They drilled, stood for inspections, and took the oath of allegiance just like the men.
The washout rate was high. Of the 25,000 women who applied to the program, only 1,830 were accepted. Of those, 1,074 earned their wings. About 40% didn't make it through. Training started at 4 months but expanded to 7 months, 210 hours of flight time and 560 hours of ground school. Because most recruits were expected to become ferry pilots, the focus was on cross-country flying. After graduation, WASP were assigned to more than 120 bases across the United States. They flew 77 different types of aircraft, everything the Army Air Forces had. Trainers, fighters, heavy bombers. They ferried planes from factories to bases, delivered aircraft for overseas shipment, and flew damaged planes back for repair. Some towed targets for live gunnery practice. Picture this: 1,000 feet of cable trailing behind your plane, a fabric sleeve target at the end, and gunners on the ground or in the air firing live ammunition at it. Mechanical failures were constant. Engines quit. Fuel ran low. The work was dangerous. Others flew test flights on new aircraft or planes fresh out of repair. If something was wrong, the pilot found out the hard way. Weather was another enemy. Women pilots crossed the country alone, navigating by sight in all conditions. Snowstorms, thunderstorms, fog, no radar, no radio beacons. If you got lost, you were on your own. A few exceptional pilots flew the B-29 Superfortress, the largest bomber in the world at the time, and notoriously difficult to fly. WASP, Dora Doherty, and Dorothea Mormon were assigned to demonstrate the plane to skeptical male pilots who feared it. Their success convinced others the B-29 could be mastered. By the time the program ended in December 1944, 38 women had died. The first trainee to die was Margaret Oldenburg, killed in a crash during training in March 1943. Cornelia Fort, one of the original WAFS pilots, died when another pilot's plane struck hers mid-flight. Mabel Rawlinson burned to death in her cockpit when her poorly maintained A-24 crashed. Hazel Ying Lee, the first Chinese-American woman in the WASP, was killed in a crash. One pilot, Gertrude Tompkins, disappeared on a ferry mission. Her fate remains unknown. Here's the harsh reality. The women of WASP were not soldiers. They were civil service employees. Despite wearing uniforms, following military discipline, and flying military missions, they were never granted military status during the war. What did that mean? It meant they earned $174.50 a month, about $3,250 in today's money, with deductions for room and board. They had to buy their own uniforms. If they washed out of training, they paid their own way home. They had minimal medical care and no life insurance. and when a WASP died, her family received nothing. No military funeral, no flag-draped coffin, no benefits. Fellow WASP took up collections to ship their friends' bodies home by train. Families were left to cover burial costs. The contrast was stark. Male pilots doing the same jobs were military members with full pay, benefits, and honors. Women doing identical work were treated as temporary civilian contractors. Why? Efforts to militarize the WASP began in 1943. General Arnold supported it. Jacqueline Cochran lobbied Congress. A bill was introduced to give the women official military rank and status.
In June 1944, the bill was defeated, 19 votes short. Opposition came from multiple directions. Male civilian pilots, many returning from combat duty, feared women would take their jobs. Veterans groups opposed the idea. Some members of Congress simply didn't believe women belonged in military aviation. The cultural resistance was fierce. The women kept flying. By late 1944, they'd logged more than 60 million miles. They'd delivered 12,650 aircraft. They'd flown every mission a male pilot flew, except combat. But the war was winding down. Male pilots were returning from overseas. The need for WASP was fading. On October 1, 1944, General Arnold issued the order. The WASP program would be disbanded effective December 20, 1944. The women were given no transition support, no veterans benefits, no formal recognition. They were simply sent home. At the final ceremony, Arnold praised their service, but it rang hollow. The WASP had proven themselves capable, reliable, and courageous, yet they were being dismissed without the honor they'd earned. Many tried to continue flying. Commercial airlines refused to hire them. One airline executive said public opinion wouldn't stand for women pilots. Some WASP wrote to foreign air forces, hoping to keep flying. Others took desk jobs. A few became instructors. Most walked away from aviation entirely. Worse still, the records of the WASP program were classified and sealed for 35 years. Like nearly all wartime files, they were locked away, inaccessible to historians and the public. The official story of World War II was written without them. Textbooks didn't mention them. Documentaries ignored them. An entire generation of Americans grew up not knowing women had flown military aircraft during the war. The WASP became ghosts, present in the war, absent from its memory. But some WASP refused to let their story die. Informal historians like Marty Weil collected scrapbooks and newspaper clippings. Women stayed in touch. They held reunions. They remembered. Then, in the 1970s, something shifted. In 1976, the U.S. Air Force announced it would begin training women as pilots, presenting it as a historic first. The WASP were outraged. They'd done this 30 years earlier. Led by Bruce Arnold, son of General Hap Arnold, and with support from Senator Barry Goldwater, a WWII veteran who'd flown alongside WASP, the women launched what they called the Battle of Congress. They lobbied, they testified, they collected petitions. They found documents proving their military service. One especially powerful piece of evidence was an honorable discharge certificate issued to WASP Helen Porter, stating she'd served in active federal service. On November 23, 1977, 33 years after the WASP were disbanded, President Jimmy Carter signed Public Law 95-202. The WASP were finally granted veteran status.
It was bittersweet. Many of the women had already died, never receiving the recognition they deserved. In 2009, President Barack Obama awarded the WASP the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors in the United States. Only about 300 WASP were still alive to witness it. The legacy of the WASP lives on. In the late 1970s, the first women were admitted to U.S. military pilot training. In 1993, combat restrictions were lifted, and women began flying fighters and bombers in combat. Today, women serve as fighter pilots, test pilots, astronauts, and commanders.
Their story is preserved now, thanks to institutions like the Library of Congress, the National WASP WWII Museum in Sweetwater, Texas, and archives at Texas Woman's University. Oral histories, photographs, uniforms, and logbooks tell the story the official record tried to forget. The women who flew for WASP were patriots. They volunteered when their country needed them. They risked their lives. They proved that courage and skill have no gender. And for 30 years, they were forgotten. Wars are remembered by battles, but also by the people who kept the planes flying. The Women Airforce Service Pilots earned their place in history. It just took history a long time to catch up. If you found this story powerful, please like this video and subscribe to Untold War Chronicles for more overlooked stories from World War II. And leave a comment, which forgotten story should we cover next? Thanks for watching, and remember their wings.